I stood in my parents' decorated living room on Christmas Eve, surrounded by 30 guests who'd once called themselves family. My brother Derek, the golden child who could do no wrong, raised his wine glass and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that I was nothing but a homeless nobody who lived in his car. My parents, Patricia and Harold, exchanged knowing smirks with Derek's wife, Sandra. Derek grinned wider and revealed he'd hired a private investigator to prove I'd been lying about cutting ties and building a new life. The report would arrive in 30 minutes, he promised. The room erupted in laughter and mockery as I stood frozen, holding my untouched eggnog. 3 years ago, when I was 29 years old, I worked as assistant manager at my father Harold's car dealership in suburban Ohio. It was a successful business, the kind that had been featured in local magazines for its sales numbers and community involvement. My brother Derek, 5 years older than me, held the position of sales director. He treated everyone cruelly, from the lot attendants to the finance managers, but especially me. He'd belittle my ideas in meetings, mock my suggestions in front of clients, and constantly remind me that he was the one Dad really trusted. Patricia, our mother, always defended Derek's behavior. She called it strong leadership, said he was preparing to take over the business someday, claimed his intensity was what made him successful. Whenever I tried to talk to her about how he treated people, she'd wave her hand dismissively and tell me I was too sensitive, that I needed to develop thicker skin if I wanted to survive in business. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I'd spent 3 months negotiating a major fleet sale with a local construction company, 25 vehicles, a deal worth over $700,000. I'd met with their operations manager 6 times, adjusted the financing package 4 times, and finally got them to sign. I walked into Harold's office with the signed contracts, proud of the work I'd done. 2 days later, at our monthly company meeting, Harold stood at the front of the conference room and praised Derek for closing the biggest fleet sale in company history. He announced a $20,000 bonus for Derek and held up the very contracts I'd negotiated. Derek stood there accepting handshakes and congratulations while I sat in the back row, my stomach churning. After the meeting, I cornered Harold in his office. I showed him my emails, my meeting notes, the documentation proving every step of that sale had been my work. Harold looked at the evidence, then looked at me with eyes that held no warmth. He said, "Family doesn't keep score." He said Derek had been instrumental in training me, so really, any success I had was because of Derek's mentorship. He told me I should be grateful Derek was willing to share credit with me at all. I walked down the hall to Derek's office. He was leaning back in his leather chair, feet on his desk, counting the bonus check. When I confronted him, he actually laughed. He said I was naive if I thought hard work mattered more than relationships. He said Harold would always choose him, so I might as well get used to being second place. That's when I started digging through old files. What I discovered made my blood run cold. For 2 years, Derek had been systematically taking credit for my work. A sale I'd closed with a local business owner, Derek's name on the final paperwork. A marketing campaign I'd designed that increased showroom traffic by 32%, Derek presenting it as his idea. A customer retention program I'd implemented, Derek receiving an award for it at the regional dealer conference. I printed everything out. I organized it into a folder. I scheduled a meeting with Harold and Patricia together. I laid it all out on their dining room table, methodical and calm. I showed them the pattern, the proof, the timeline. I asked them why they'd let this happen. Patricia looked at the papers like they offended her. She said I was being jealous and ungrateful. She said I was trying to tear the family apart out of spite. She accused me of fabricating evidence because I couldn't handle Derek's success. Harold just shook his head and said he was disappointed in me for trying to sabotage my own brother. I quit on the spot. I told them I was done with the dealership, done with the lies, done with being treated like I didn't matter. Patricia called after me as I walked out, saying I'd regret throwing away my future. Harold said I'd come crawling back within a month when I realized how good I'd had it. I moved out of my apartment near the family that same week. I cut all contact. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't respond to their emails. I returned their Christmas cards unopened. For 3 years, I built a life they knew nothing about. Last week, my cousin Emma reached out via social media. She sent me a long message begging me to come to Christmas. She said Patricia was sick, that the doctors weren't sure how much time she had left, that the family needed to come together. She said Mom cried every night because I wasn't there. She said Dad had aged 10 years from the stress of our estrangement. Guilt ate at me for 3 days. I thought about my mother being ill. I thought about the possibility of never seeing her again. Finally, I messaged Emma back and agreed to come to this one gathering. When I arrived at the house tonight, Patricia opened the door looking healthier than I'd ever seen her. Her color was good. Her energy was high. She wasn't sick at all. Before I could even process what that meant, Derek appeared behind her with a smile that made my skin crawl. He said it was good of me to finally show my face. He said we had a lot to talk about. That's when I realized the truth. Patricia wasn't sick. Emma's message had been a lie, and whether she knew it or not, she'd been part of Derek's trap. He'd orchestrated this entire evening to publicly humiliate me. Over the next hour, as guests arrived and the party filled with noise and laughter, I pieced together his motivation from overheard conversations. My absence had made the family look bad in their tight social circle. People asked questions. People wondered why Harold's younger son never came around. Derek wanted to prove I'd failed without them, that I was nothing without the family name and connections. Now, standing in the center of the living room with all eyes on me, Derek held court like a prosecutor presenting his case. He positioned himself near the fireplace where the Christmas stockings hung, the perfect spot for maximum attention. The room had gone quiet after his initial announcement, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Derek loved an audience. He always had. He cleared his throat dramatically and began explaining how he'd hired Gregory Palmer, a private investigator with an office in downtown Cleveland, 2 months ago. He'd paid $3,000 for a comprehensive surveillance report on my life. He wanted facts, he said, not speculation. His theory, which he laid out with mock concern in his voice, was that I'd been living in my old Honda Civic. He said I was probably working minimum wage jobs, too proud to admit I'd made a terrible mistake leaving the family business. He painted a picture of me sleeping in parking lots, eating fast food, showering at truck stops. The image he created was designed for maximum humiliation. Sandra, Derek's wife, stood beside him nodding along. She added her own cruel commentary about how I'd thrown away my future out of stubbornness. She said she'd always known I didn't have what it took to make it on my own. She suggested maybe this would be a good learning experience for me, that sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they can accept help. Harold sat in his recliner near the window, nodding approvingly. He said a man who abandons his family deserves what he gets. He said he'd tried to teach me about loyalty and responsibility, but I'd been too stubborn to listen. He looked around at the guests, seeking their agreement, and several people nodded back at him. Patricia sat on the couch, dabbing at fake tears with a tissue. She said they'd tried so hard to help me. She said they'd reached out repeatedly, but I'd refused every attempt at reconciliation. She made herself the victim, the grieving mother whose son had broken her heart. Other family members and friends chimed in with their opinions. Aunt Carol, my father's sister, mentioned she'd seen someone who looked like me at a truck stop about 6 months ago. She said the man had looked tired and dirty, and she'd been too ashamed to approach him. Uncle Raymond, who practiced law in Cincinnati, said he'd always known I didn't have what it takes to succeed in the real world. He said some people are built for independence, and others need structure and family support. I remained calm through all of it. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I just checked my watch. 28 minutes had passed since Derek's initial announcement. 2 more minutes until the investigator's report arrived. Derek's friend Jason, a guy I'd gone to high school with, asked why I wasn't saying anything. He seemed genuinely curious, like he expected me to be shouting denials or making excuses. The room turned their attention to me, waiting for a response. Derek answered before I could. He said it was because I knew they were about to expose the truth. He said I had no defense, no explanation that would make any sense. He said the evidence was about to arrive and then everyone would see him for what he really was. The doorbell rang. Derek's eyes lit up. He practically ran to the front door, and I could hear him thanking the courier. When he came back into the living room, he held a large manila envelope above his head like a trophy. People actually applauded. He made a show of opening it slowly, building the suspense, but as he pulled out the papers and began reading, his expression changed. The color drained from his face. His hands started shaking. He looked up at me with something like panic in his eyes, then quickly tried to shove the papers back into the envelope. Harold noticed immediately. He stood up from his recliner and crossed the room in 4 long strides. He snatched the papers from Derek's hands before Derek could hide them. Derek tried to grab them back, but Harold turned away, already reading. Harold's voice filled the room as he began reading aloud. The address listed for me was a modern downtown loft in Columbus, Ohio, about 2 hours south of where we stood. Not a car, not a shelter. A loft in one of the newly renovated buildings near the Arena District. The report detailed that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a company called Summit Strategies. Harold's voice caught slightly as he read that part. Summit Strategies was a digital marketing agency. According to the investigator's findings, the company employed 17 people and had generated $2.3 million in revenue in the previous fiscal year. I owned the loft outright. The report included the purchase price, $450,000, paid in cash 2 years ago. My vehicle was a Tesla Model S, not the 15-year-old Honda Civic I'd driven when I worked at the dealership. The license plate number was listed. The report even noted that I had a reserved parking spot in the building's garage. Gregory Palmer had been thorough. The envelope contained photographs. Harold shuffled through them, his face getting redder with each image. There were pictures of me at business meetings, shaking hands with clients in conference rooms. Photos of me at networking events, wearing suits that cost more than I used to make in a month at the dealership. Images of my office, a corner space, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Scioto River. The room had gone completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the hardwood floor. Patricia stammered that there must be some mistake. She said investigators can be fooled. She suggested maybe I'd hired an actor to impersonate me, or rented props for photographs. Derek grabbed the papers back from Harold. He flipped through them frantically, looking at the financial documents, the business registration records filed with the Ohio Secretary of State, the lease agreements, the bank statements. His face had gone from white to a mottled red. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the house. Harold's face contorted with rage. The veins in his neck bulged, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Sandra looked confused, then angry. She turned to Derek with an expression that suggested she was about to have a very different conversation with her husband later that evening. She crossed her arms and took a small step away from him. I finally spoke. My voice came out calm, steady. I explained that I'd started Summit Strategies from nothing after I left the dealership. For the first year, I worked 2 jobs. During the day, I did freelance marketing consulting for small businesses. At night, I worked the front desk at a hotel near the Ohio State University campus. I lived in a tiny studio apartment that cost $500 a month. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. I saved every dollar I didn't absolutely need to spend. While working those jobs, I built my client base. I started with small projects, building websites for local restaurants, and managing social media for retail stores. I delivered quality work. I met deadlines. I charged fair prices. Word spread. My first major client was a tech startup run by 3 Ohio State graduates. They were building an app for college students. They had a tiny budget but big dreams. I took them on. 2 years later, that startup went public. The founders remembered who'd helped them when no one else would. They referred me to other startups, other entrepreneurs. My business grew. I hired my first employee, then my second. I moved out of the studio and into a better apartment. I bought used office furniture off Craigslist and rented a small office space. I reinvested everything back into the business. Every profit went toward better equipment, better software, hiring talented people. I worked 70-hour weeks. I learned everything I could about digital marketing, about entrepreneurship, about managing teams. I made mistakes and learned from them. I lost clients and figured out why. I celebrated small victories and used failures as stepping stones. Several guests looked impressed. Others seemed shocked. A few people started whispering to each other. The dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Derek sputtered, trying to regain control of the narrative. He said the documents didn't prove anything. He suggested they could be fabricated. He said anyone could create fake financial statements and business registrations. He waved the papers dismissively, but his hand was still shaking. Harold demanded to know why I hadn't told them about any of this. His voice boomed through the room. He wanted to know why I'd let them think I was struggling. He acted as though I'd wronged him by not keeping him informed of my success. I pulled out my phone. I opened my photos and found the image I'd saved 18 months ago. I held the phone up so Harold could see it clearly. It was a photograph of an envelope addressed to Harold and Patricia at this very house. The return address was my loft in Columbus. Inside that envelope, according to the note I'd included, was a letter explaining everything I'd built. I'd included my business card. I'd written my new address, my phone number, my email. I'd invited them to visit, to see what I'd created, to be part of my new life. The envelope in the photograph had been returned unopened. Across the front, in Harold's distinctive handwriting, was a note. "We have no son who abandons his family. Don't contact us again until you're ready to apologize. You are not welcome here." I scrolled to the next photo. It showed the letter that had been inside, the one they never read. I'd kept copies of everything. Patricia's face crumbled. Her hand went to her mouth. The fake tears from earlier were replaced by real ones, but these came from shame, not sympathy. She looked around the room at all the guests who were now staring at her with different expressions. Several people shifted uncomfortably. The aunt who'd claimed to see me at a truck stop suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. The uncle who'd said I didn't have what it takes stared at the floor. Cousin Emma, standing near the kitchen doorway, had tears running down her face. Derek tried desperately to regain control. He raised his voice, saying that having some little business didn't change the fundamental issue. "I'd abandoned my family," he insisted. "I'd chosen pride over relationships." He looked around the room seeking support, but fewer people were meeting his eyes now. I remained calm. I said there was more to Gregory Palmer's report that Derek hadn't read yet. I suggested Harold might want to look at the section toward the back, the pages Derek had tried to hide. Harold's hands trembled as he flipped through the document. He found a section labeled Subjects, Charitable Activities, and Community Involvement. His eyes scanned the pages, and I watched his face transform from anger to something else entirely. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. The report revealed everything I'd been doing anonymously for the past 2 years. I'd been donating to local charities throughout northeastern Ohio, the communities where I'd grown up. The investigator had somehow tracked the donations back to shell corporations I'd set up for privacy. Harold's voice cracked as he read aloud. $15,000 to cover cancer treatments for Mrs. Henderson, Patricia's neighbor and longtime friend. Mrs. Henderson had been facing bankruptcy when her insurance denied coverage for an experimental treatment. An anonymous donor had contacted the hospital and paid the entire balance. $25,000 annually to fund scholarship programs at the community college, where both Derek and I had taken business courses before I went to work at the dealership. The scholarships were designated for students from low-income families who showed potential but lacked resources. $10,000 annually to support the youth center, where Derek and I had played basketball as kids. The center had been struggling with budget cuts. An anonymous donor had stepped in to fund their after-school programs and summer camps. The list continued. Donations to the food bank, support for a women's shelter, funding for a program that provided interview clothes and job training for unemployed workers. Mrs. Henderson was actually at the party. She'd been standing near the dining room, probably invited by Patricia to witness my supposed humiliation. When Harold read her name and the amount, she gasped. Her hand flew to her chest. She started crying, real tears that came from deep gratitude and shock. She spoke up, her voice shaking. She confirmed that someone anonymous had indeed paid her medical bills 18 months ago. She'd been 2 weeks from losing her house. The hospital had been threatening collections. Then suddenly, miraculously, the entire balance was cleared. She'd tried to find out who did it, but the hospital said the donor insisted on complete anonymity. She'd prayed every day to thank whoever had saved her life. Emma finally found her voice. She stepped forward from the kitchen doorway. She revealed that when her mother, my Aunt Susan, had died suddenly last year, the funeral costs had been overwhelming. Emma had been trying to figure out how to pay for everything when the funeral home called to say an anonymous donor had covered all the expenses. She'd never known who. Now she understood. The energy in the room had completely shifted. People were looking at Derek and Patricia with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. The narrative Derek had tried to create was falling apart. Instead of a failed, homeless son, they were seeing someone who'd succeeded beyond any of their expectations and used that success to help others quietly, without seeking recognition. Sandra spoke quietly to Derek, but in the silence of the room, everyone could hear her. She asked if he'd known about any of this. Her voice held an edge of accusation. Derek insisted I'd done it all to show off, to make the family look bad by comparison. He said it was a calculated move to manipulate people's emotions. I shook my head. I told the room the truth. I'd helped those people because they needed it, and because it was the right thing to do. I'd kept it anonymous because I didn't want gratitude or recognition. I'd simply seen people struggling with problems I now had the resources to help solve. Mrs. Henderson had always been kind to me as a kid. The youth center had given me a safe place to go after school. The community college had given me my first real education in business. I was giving back to people and places that had given to me. Patricia tried to approach me. Her tears were genuine now, streaming down her face. She reached out her hands toward me and called me sweetheart, a term she hadn't used in years. She said she didn't know, that she'd had no idea I'd been doing all these things. I stepped back, maintaining the distance between us. My voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now. I told her she didn't know because she'd never asked. In 3 years, she'd never once wondered if I was okay. She'd never questioned the narrative Derek and Harold had created about me having a mental breakdown. She'd never doubted the story they spread through the community that I was unstable, unreliable, mentally ill. Derek had told people at the dealership that I'd been fired for theft. He'd spread rumors to clients that I'd stolen customer information. He'd tried to poison every professional relationship I might have had in the area. I pulled out my phone again. I'd saved certain things, knowing this confrontation might come someday. I found the voicemail Derek had left me 1 year ago. I played it on speaker, the volume turned up so everyone in the room could hear. Derek's voice came through the phone, tinny but clear. In the message, he was laughing. He talked about how he'd successfully spread rumors about me. He bragged about contacting my early clients, trying to discredit me. He said I deserved to suffer for walking away from the family. He called me worthless trash. He said I'd never succeed at anything. He threatened legal action if I ever tried to contact the family again. The message was vile, filled with cruelty and contempt. The room was absolutely silent as the message played. When it ended, no one spoke. Sandra had gone pale. Several guests looked away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The voicemail finished playing, but Derek's cruel voice seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Sandra stood frozen, staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Her mouth opened, then closed. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked Derek what he'd done. Harold tried to defend his oldest son. He said Derek had been protecting the family name. He claimed that sometimes tough measures were necessary to deal with difficult situations. He looked around the room for support, but found none. People were looking at their drinks, at the floor, at the Christmas tree, anywhere but at Harold's face. I cut through Harold's excuses. I asked him directly what Derek had been protecting. Was he protecting the family from the truth that I could succeed without them? Was he protecting the lie that I needed the dealership more than the dealership needed honest workers? More truth spilled out. I explained that Derek had called my first 3 potential clients when I started Summit Strategies. This was in the early days, when every client meant the difference between survival and failure. Derek had called these business owners and told them I'd been fired from the family dealership for unethical practices. He'd lied about my credentials, my experience, my character. He'd done everything he could to sabotage me before I even had a chance to begin. But those clients had done something Derek hadn't anticipated. They'd checked my references anyway. They'd talked to people I'd worked with before Derek had gotten to them. They'd looked at samples of my work. They'd given me a chance, and I'd delivered quality results. My work spoke for itself, loud enough to overcome Derek's lies. Harold was still flipping through Gregory Palmer's report. The investigator had been incredibly thorough, perhaps more thorough than Derek had wanted. Harold found another section, this one with a different title, Additional Findings Regarding Subject's Brother. The room watched, as Harold's face changed again. He read silently at first, his eyes moving faster and faster across the page. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier strength. The investigator, in doing his job properly, had uncovered something unexpected. Derek had been embezzling from Harold's dealership. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate detection, but consistent enough to add up significantly over time. 5 years of theft totaling $87,000. Gregory Palmer had included evidence. Harold shuffled through pages of altered expense reports, fake vendor invoices, duplicate reimbursements for travel that never happened. The investigator had highlighted the patterns, connected the dots, laid out a case that would hold up in any audit or court proceeding. Harold's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the papers. His face had gone from red to a grayish color. He looked decades older than he had an hour ago. He turned to Derek and demanded to know if it was true. Derek panicked. He lunged for the papers, trying to grab them out of Harold's hands. Harold pushed him away with surprising force. Derek stumbled backward, caught himself on the arm of the couch. He started making excuses, stammering that he'd borrowed the money, that he'd always planned to pay it back. He said he'd had unexpected expenses, that Sandra didn't know, that he'd been going to come clean eventually. Sandra started crying. These weren't quiet tears, but loud, gasping sobs. She said Derek had told her they'd received an inheritance from his grandmother who'd passed away 4 years ago. She thought that's where their new kitchen had come from, the vacation to Hawaii, the private school tuition for their daughter. She'd had no idea any of it was stolen money. The party guests were utterly silent. Some looked horrified. Others looked fascinated in the way people can't help but watch something terrible unfold. It was like witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Uncle Raymond, the lawyer, asked to see the documents. Harold handed them over numbly. Raymond examined them carefully, his practiced eyes scanning the evidence. After several long minutes, he confirmed that the documents appeared legitimate and comprehensive. He said if this went to the authorities, Derek would likely face criminal charges. 2 years later, that startup went public. The founders remembered who'd helped them when no one else would. They referred me to other startups, other entrepreneurs. My business grew. I hired my first employee, then my second. I moved out of the studio and into a better apartment. I bought used office furniture off Craigslist and rented a small office space. Then Harold did something that shocked everyone in the room, including me. He buried his face in his hands and admitted the truth. His voice was muffled, broken. He said he'd known about the embezzlement. He'd discovered it 6 months ago while reviewing financial records. He'd found the discrepancies, traced them back to Derek, confronted him privately. Harold demanded to know why I hadn't told them about any of this. His voice boomed through the room. He wanted to know why I'd let them think I was struggling. He acted as though I'd wronged him by not keeping him informed of my success. Harold had hidden the evidence. He'd adjusted the books. He'd taken money from his personal accounts to cover the shortfalls. He'd done it all because he couldn't bear the shame of having his oldest son revealed as a thief. He'd told himself that family protects family, that public exposure would destroy everything he'd built. He looked up at me with devastated eyes. Tears ran down his face into his gray beard. He said he'd chosen to protect the wrong son. He'd covered for a thief, while refusing to even read a letter from the son who'd actually made something of himself. The room erupted. People started talking all at once. Sandra grabbed her coat from the closet near the front door. She told Derek through her tears that she was leaving. She was taking their daughter Emma, their 10-year-old who'd been upstairs playing with her tablet unaware of the drama below, and they were going to her mother's house. She said she couldn't even look at him right now. Derek tried to follow her, tried to apologize. He grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. She told him not to touch her. She said she'd married a man she thought was honorable and successful, but she'd been living with a liar and a thief. She called her daughter's name, and the little girl appeared at the top of the stairs, confused by the shouting. Harold stood, his posture defeated. He told Derek to leave his house. His voice carried no anger now, just exhaustion. He said he didn't want to see Derek's face. Patricia cried out in protest, but Harold ignored her. He repeated that Derek needed to leave. Now, tonight. Derek turned on me. His face transformed with rage. He screamed that this was all my fault. I'd brought that investigator's report. I'd exposed his secrets. I'd destroyed his family. Spittle flew from his mouth as he shouted. Several guests backed away from him. I remained still, my voice calm. I pointed out that Derek had hired the investigator. He'd been the one who wanted to dig into my life and expose my secrets. The truth had come out because he'd gone looking for it. If he'd left me alone, none of this would have happened. He'd set this entire nightmare in motion himself. Guests started leaving. They grabbed their coats, mumbled awkward goodbyes, hurried to their cars. Nobody wanted to be part of this family implosion anymore. Within 10 minutes, the room had cleared of everyone except immediate family and a few close relatives who felt obligated to stay. Mrs. Henderson approached me before she left. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. She wrapped her arms around me in a tight hug. She thanked me through tears, her voice muffled against my chest. She said I'd saved her life. She said she prayed for me every single day, even not knowing who I was. She promised to keep praying, now that she knew. She pulled back and looked up at me with a fierce expression. She told me I was a good man, the kind the world needed more of. Emma, my cousin who'd sent the message that brought me here, approached next. She was 24, working as a teacher in the local elementary school. She apologized for not defending me earlier in the evening. She said she'd been afraid of going against the family narrative. She'd been complicit in the lies, even if she'd never said cruel things herself. Her silence had been its own form of betrayal. She asked if I could forgive her. I told her I understood. Standing up to family is one of the hardest things a person can do. I didn't hold her earlier silence against her. Harold approached me slowly, like someone walking toward their own execution. He tried to apologize. His words came out jumbled, desperate. He said he'd been wrong, so terribly wrong. He said he'd let his pride and his favoritism blind him to the truth. He asked if I could forgive him. He said he wanted to make things right. Patricia joined in. She grabbed my hands despite my instinct to pull away. She promised they could start over. She said I could come back to the dealership. She suggested they could make Derek pay back all the money he'd stolen. She painted a picture of reconciliation and healing, of the family coming back together stronger than before. I looked at them both for a long moment. The room waited in silence for my response. These were my parents. Despite everything, part of me still remembered being a child, loving them, trusting them, but that child was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned hard lessons about self-worth and boundaries. I spoke quietly, but every word was deliberate. I explained that forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. I could forgive them for my own peace, to release the anger and hurt I'd carried. Forgiveness was something I could give them freely. But reconciliation required trust, and trust had to be rebuilt over time through consistent actions, not just words spoken in a moment of crisis. I told them they'd taught me what kind of family I didn't want to be. They'd shown me the damage that favoritism causes, how lies compound until they poison everything, how choosing pride over truth destroys relationships. Those were valuable lessons, even though learning them had been painful. Harold argued that they could change. He promised they'd do better. He swore things would be different. Patricia nodded eagerly, adding that she'd go to therapy. She'd make amends to everyone she'd hurt. She listed out promises like she was negotiating a business deal. I let them finish. Then I told them something they weren't expecting. I was getting married in 3 months. Her name was Lauren. I'd been with her for 2 years. She was kind, intelligent, funny. She worked as a physical therapist at a children's hospital. She loved me for who I was, not who she wanted me to be. She'd never met them. She knew the story of what had happened, but she'd never heard their voices or seen their faces. We were expecting our first child. Lauren was 3 months pregnant. We'd found out right before Thanksgiving. We were excited, terrified, ready. We'd been looking at baby names and painting a nursery in our loft. We'd been building the kind of family I'd always wished I'd had. 18 months ago, when I sent that letter they'd returned unopened, I'd invited them to be part of this life. The letter had included an invitation to visit, to see my business, to meet Lauren. I'd wanted them to know they had a chance to be part of something good. They'd rejected it. They'd sent it back with a cruel note and never looked back. I told them I'd come to the party tonight because Emma said Patricia was sick. That was compassion. That was me caring despite everything. But I wasn't going to stay in a relationship where I constantly had to prove my worth. I already knew my worth. Lauren knew it. My employees knew it. My clients knew it. The people I'd helped knew it. I didn't need Harold and Patricia's validation anymore. Patricia asked about the baby. Would they ever get to meet their grandchild? Her voice broke on the word grandchild. Harold looked stricken, probably just realizing what he'd lost. I paused at that question. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I told them it depended on them. If they wanted to be part of my life, they'd have to earn it. Not with words, but with consistent actions over time. My door wasn't locked, but I wasn't opening it just because they knocked once. They'd have to show me they'd genuinely changed, that they understood what they'd done wrong, that they were willing to do the work to become better people. I looked at Derek, who was sitting on the stairs with his head in his hands. Sandra had already left with their daughter. The house that had been full of noise and people an hour ago was now nearly empty and silent. I told Derek he'd spent years trying to prove he was better than me. He didn't have to compete anymore. I wasn't in his race. I'd never been in his race. I hoped he'd figure out who he was, without tearing someone else down to feel tall. Derek didn't respond. His shoulders shook. Whether from anger or grief or shame, I couldn't tell. It didn't matter anymore. I walked toward the front door. Each step felt lighter than the last. Harold called after me, asking what he should do about Derek. Should he call the police? Should he press charges? Should he try to work it out privately? He sounded lost. A man who'd built his identity on being in control, now realizing he'd never really been in control of anything. I turned back. I told him that was between him and Derek. But if he covered for Derek again, he'd just be enabling the same pattern. He'd be teaching Derek that actions don't have consequences, that family means you can hurt people without accountability. Real love sometimes means letting people face the results of their choices. It means saying no. It means enforcing boundaries, even when it's painful. Patricia asked if they'd ever see me again. Her voice was small, vulnerable. She wanted to know if she'd get to meet her grandchild. The question hung in the air between us. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. That question deserved a real answer. I told them it depended entirely on them. If they wanted to be part of my life, they'd have to earn that privilege. Not with words or promises made in a moment of crisis, but with consistent actions over months and years. My door wasn't locked forever, but I wasn't opening it just because they knocked once. They'd have to show me through their choices that they understood what they'd done wrong. They'd have to demonstrate that they were willing to change, to treat people with respect, to value honesty over image. If they could do that work, genuinely and consistently, then maybe someday there could be a relationship. But it would be a new relationship, built on new terms, with clear boundaries and mutual respect. I looked at Derek one last time. He was still sitting on the stairs, head in his hands. I told him something I hoped would eventually sink in. He'd spent years trying to prove he was better than me, competing in a race I'd never entered. He didn't have to do that anymore. I wasn't his competition. I'd never been his competition. I hoped he'd figure out who he was, without needing to tear someone else down to feel valuable. Derek didn't respond. His shoulders shook, whether from anger or grief or shame, I couldn't tell. It didn't matter anymore. His journey was his own now. I walked out of the house and crossed the lawn to where my Tesla was parked at the curb. The winter air felt clean and cold in my lungs. I could see my breath in small clouds. Christmas lights twinkled on houses up and down the street. Somewhere in the distance, I heard church bells ringing. I got in my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. I pulled out my phone and called Lauren. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and concerned. She asked how it went. I told her exactly how I expected. The truth had come out. The family had imploded. Derek's crimes were exposed. Harold's complicity was revealed. Patricia's lies were laid bare. It had been brutal and ugly and necessary. Lauren asked if I was okay. That simple question, asked with genuine care, almost broke me. I took a breath and told her the truth. I was better than okay. I felt lighter. I felt free. The weight I'd been carrying for 3 years, the burden of their judgment and rejection, had lifted. She said she'd make hot chocolate, and we could talk when I got home. She asked if I wanted to stop and get anything on the drive back. I told her just to be there. That was all I needed. She laughed, that bright sound that had first made me fall in love with her. She said she wasn't going anywhere. As I drove through the dark streets toward the highway, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, sitting in Harold's dealership office, with proof of Derek's theft of my work, I'd felt worthless. I'd questioned everything about myself. Was I not good enough? Not smart enough? Not worthy of recognition or respect? Cutting ties with my family had felt like failure at the time. I'd grown up believing family was everything, that blood was thicker than water, that you stuck together no matter what. Walking away had felt like admitting defeat. But that distance had given me something invaluable. It gave me space to discover my own strength. Without Harold's shadow, or Derek's cruelty, or Patricia's favoritism, I'd learned who I was. Building summit strategies from nothing had taught me resilience I never knew I possessed. Every obstacle I overcame, every client I earned, every employee I hired, proved to me that I was capable. Meeting Lauren had taught me what healthy love actually looked like. She didn't keep score. She didn't play favorites or pit people against each other. She celebrated my successes without needing to diminish them. When I struggled, she supported me without making me feel weak. She was a partner in every sense of the word. The baby growing inside her represented a future I was creating intentionally. I would be a father who saw his children clearly, who valued them for who they were rather than who I wanted them to be. I would never pit siblings against each other or play favorites. I would teach them that family is defined by how you treat each other, not just by shared DNA. I realized my family's rejection had actually been a gift, though I'd never asked for it. Their refusal to see my value had forced me to find it within myself. Their lies about me had made me fiercely committed to honesty. Their favoritism had taught me the importance of equity. Their cruelty had made me determined to be kind. I felt genuine peace now, not anger. I didn't hate Harold or Patricia or even Derek. I felt something closer to pity. They'd built their lives on appearance and control and favoritism, and tonight that foundation had cracked. They'd have to decide now whether to rebuild on something more solid or keep clinging to the rubble. My phone rang through the car speakers. I glanced at the screen. It was Emma. I answered, and her voice came through shaky with tears. She apologized again for being part of the trap tonight. She said she hadn't known Derek's real plan. She'd thought she was helping bring the family together. I told her I understood. I asked if she was okay. She laughed bitterly and said the party had cleared out fast. Uncle Raymond was helping Harold and Patricia deal with the situation. Sandra had called from her mother's house to say she'd filed for separation. Derek had left without saying where he was going. Emma said she'd spent the last hour thinking about everything. She realized how toxic the family dynamics had always been. She'd just been too close to see it. She asked if we could stay in touch, maybe meet for coffee sometime when I was in the area. I told her I'd like that. She'd been brave tonight, speaking up about the funeral expenses. That had meant something. We could build a relationship separate from the rest of the family drama. After we hung up, I drove in silence for a while. The highway was mostly empty this late on Christmas Eve. Most people were home with their families, gathered around trees and fireplaces, sharing meals and traditions. I thought about the life I was driving back to. Lauren waiting with hot chocolate, our loft with its view of the city. The nursery we'd started painting a soft yellow because we wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. The business I'd built that employed people and changed lives. The quiet, anonymous donations that helped people who needed it. That was my real family now. Not the people I'd been born to, but the ones I'd chosen and who'd chosen me back. Lauren, who loved me on my worst days. My employees, who trusted me to lead fairly. My clients, who valued my work. Mrs. Henderson and Emma, and the others whose lives had intersected with mine in meaningful ways. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't proving Harold and Patricia wrong. It wasn't Derek's public humiliation or Harold's devastation at discovering his golden child's crimes. The best revenge was simply living well, building a life I was proud of, becoming the kind of person I wanted to be, choosing kindness over cruelty, honesty over lies, growth over stagnation. I couldn't force Harold to see my value, or Patricia to regret her favoritism, or Derek to change his character, but I could control who I became and how I treated people. I could choose to break the cycle, to build something better, to be different. As I pulled into my building's parking garage and found my reserved spot, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Complete peace, no anger, no resentment, no desperate need for validation or recognition. Just quiet satisfaction with the life I'd created and excitement for the future I was building. I rode the elevator up to the 8th floor. When I opened the door to the loft, Lauren was on the couch with 2 mugs of hot chocolate on the coffee table. She looked up and smiled, and I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We sat together for hours that night, talking through everything that had happened. She listened without judgment. She asked questions without pushing. When I talked about the pain of seeing my parents' faces when they realized what they'd lost, she held my hand. When I described Derek's voicemail and how ugly it had been, she reminded me that his cruelty said everything about him and nothing about me. Eventually, we moved to the window. The city spread out below us, lights twinkling like earthbound stars. She put her hand on her belly, and I covered it with mine. We stood there in comfortable silence, looking out at the world we were bringing our child into. I thought about what I wanted to teach this baby. Not to seek approval from people who couldn't give it. Not to compete for love or acceptance. Not to measure their worth by someone else's opinion. But to know their value. To trust their abilities. To build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. Sometimes the people who should love you most will fail you. That failure will hurt in ways that leave permanent scars. But those scars can become sources of strength. They can teach you what not to do, who not to be. They can motivate you to build something better. Your worth isn't determined by family approval or public recognition. It's not measured by whether your parents are proud, or your siblings are jealous, or your community acknowledges you. Your worth comes from who you are, how you treat people, what you build, how you grow. Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. It's about setting goals and reaching them, not for applause but for the satisfaction of achievement. It's about becoming someone you respect when you look in the mirror. Walking away from toxicity isn't abandonment or failure. Sometimes it's the only path to survival and growth. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is create distance from people who diminish you, even if those people are family. Forgiveness can exist without reconciliation. You can release anger and move forward without rebuilding relationships that harmed you. You can wish people well from a distance without inviting them back into your life. Real family is built on mutual respect, not obligation. It's chosen, not just inherited. The people who celebrate your victories without jealousy, who support you through failures without judgment, who see your value without needing proof, those are your real family. And perhaps most importantly, you can't force people to see your value. but you can absolutely choose to surround yourself with people who already do. As Lauren and I finally headed to bed that Christmas morning, the sky beginning to lighten with dawn, I felt grateful. Grateful for the 3 years of struggle that taught me strength. Grateful for the rejection that forced me to find my own path. Grateful for the pain that showed me what I didn't want to become. Grateful for Lauren and the life we were building together. The family I'd been born into had failed me, but the family I'd chosen, and the one I was creating, would be different, better, built on love and honesty and respect. And that was worth more than any amount of belated recognition from people who'd never really seen me at all. Have you ever had to walk away from people you loved because staying was hurting you? How did you find the strength to choose yourself? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming family challenges and building the life you deserve. And share this with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to choose your own peace over toxic relationships. Thank you for listening, and I hope you find the courage to build the family and life you truly deserve.